Hey, what's up guys? So we had a pretty bloody first round of the 2020 FIDE Candidates, and I actually don't think that's too unexpected. These Candidates tournaments are often very exciting, and there often tends to be a lot of decisive games for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's really only the first place that everyone is playing for, so everyone is trying to really do their best and is very ambitious and trying to win as many games as possible. But I think it's also the stress and pressure of the tournament that probably leads players to not play as well as their typical standard, often leads to more blunders, especially with what's going on in the world right now with the virus. I think it really puts a lot of pressure on the players, and we're probably going to be seeing a lot of decisive games in this tournament. It could really be an absolute bloodbath from here on out. So recapping the results from today, of course the big result was Wang Hao defeating Liren with the black pieces. And Jan Nepomniachtchi as well scored a win against Giri, also with black. The other two games, MVL Caruana and Grischuk versus Alekseenko, these finished in draws. I would say Grischuk had some real winning chances in his game, but ultimately couldn't finish it off, likely due to time pressure, whereas MVL Caruana was pretty balanced throughout. Of course, this is a very long tournament, 14 rounds, double round robin, so the first round is way too early to count anyone out, but it is pretty huge for both Liren and Giri. Ding is of course considered one of the absolute favorites. Anish is also a very ambitious player himself, so losing with white in the first round is certainly going to diminish their spirits, but hopefully they come back and start scoring some wins of their own. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of these games. The first game I want to cover is between Liren and Wang Hao, and here Ding went for the English opening. I would say we had a pretty typical development scheme here, where white is kind of playing this reverse Sicilian dragon, and Wang Hao chooses a setup with c6 and d6, kind of a very flexible approach, really just trying to blunt white's bishop on g2 with these pawns and keeping his center stable. So as we go here through the opening and into the middle game, Ding ends up taking a lot of space here, especially with this move e4, grabs more space in the center. Black plays a5, white plays bishop b2, knight a6, and this is a kind of a provocative move, asking white to push forward with b5, and Liren goes ahead and takes this space advantage. Then after takes, knight c5, we get a really interesting structure with knight takes and then a4, where white is left with this really weak pawn on d3, but it's actually quite difficult for black to put pressure on it. He really is going to take black a lot of moves before he's able to double and triple on the d file. And in the meantime, black does have to defend the e5 pawn, so it's not so easy for black to maneuver and take advantage of the weakness of the d3 pawn. The d4 square is also a square that black would like to use, but that would take many moves. Black would have to play knight d7, knight f8, knight e6 before black is able to get the square under his control. So it seems like white was definitely slightly better in this opening here, at least with this pressure against the e5 pawn. Ding puts the rook on a3, defending the pawn for the long run. Knight d7, h3, bishop h5, queen b1, unpinning so that he can maneuver his knight to d2 and c4. And then after b6, knight d2, knight f8, and bishop f3, we actually get a really interesting moment. Now, black's next move was actually covered by my co-worker, Grandmaster Jesse Cry, who's also doing videos on this channel, and his move of the day was black's next move, queen g5, which actually turns out to be really deep. Now I'd encourage you guys to go and check out Jesse's video if you want the full breakdown of what exactly was the deeper point behind this move and how black came to this conclusion. But long story short, he was trying to induce this move h4, after which he plays queen to g6, and this h4 pawn ends up being kind of a long-term problem for white. It doesn't really appear to be such a problem right now, but black's deep point was that if white ever wants to push the pawn to f4, which Ding ends up doing later in the game, then after the capture e takes f4, g takes f4, this pawn on h4 ends up being a lot weaker than it would have been on h3. So actually a really deep idea by Wang Hao, and once again I'd encourage you guys to check out Jesse's video for the full breakdown of this move. It's really fascinating stuff. Anyways, we end up trading some pieces here, h5, queen f5. Wang Hao simply puts all of his pieces in the center, and he's a little bit worse here, but clearly black's position is solid, and it really is going to take some work for white to try and convert his edge. So then a couple moves later, we end up getting Ding Liren's kind of main blunder of the game. Here he goes ahead and pushes f4. This move was, of course, widely criticized. I think I saw one commentator saying this is the worst move Ding Liren has played in years. Maybe that's a little bit harsh, but the point is I'm sure this is a move that Ding will end up regretting. Once again, after ef4, bishop takes f4. G takes f4 would have been the strategic choice, but of course white cannot do this with the h4 pawn hanging. So he takes with the bishop, knight takes f4, G takes f4, and now black plays f5. Now I should mention quickly back here that if black had played bishop takes f4, then G takes f4 is absolutely fine for white, as black doesn't really have time to grab this pawn on h4. White will play king h3, for example, the knight will have to move back, and then white is actually going to be able to grab this pawn on b6. So black's bishop is kind of tied to this pawn on b6, but as long as it's here protecting it, the knight on c4 can put pressure, the bishop will kind of handle it, but the bishop can also exert its own pressure on this diagonal as well. So here Wang Hao plays f5, and this kind of really makes things difficult for white's structure. E takes f5 is almost certainly out of the question. Black will just play king f6, win back this pawn, and then white will just be left with numerous pawn weaknesses, and black's rook's coming in to try and put a lot of pressure on white's position. So instead white pushes e5, and it looks like white has a lot of space and a pretty comfortable position. He can defend the d3 pawn with moves like rook f3 or rook to d1. But after black's next move, rook e6, now it starts to become really clear the weaknesses in white's position. This rook is headed to g6 and then will be threatening to go to g4. And white really doesn't want to put the king on h3. This will just be very, very passive for the king. Also, the bishop can support the rook with bishop to d8. And now we can really see the problem of white's pawn here being on h4. If the pawn was on h3, it would be a much easier position for white to play. Maybe he would even still have an advantage. So the game continues, and as it turns out, although black has a huge advantage here, Ding does miss a huge opportunity to equalize the game. After the moves rook a2, rook d4, black does a little triangulation here with the rook, knight e3, rook to d7, and this is actually move 40, so this is the move right before they gain more time. Ding ends up playing rook d2, just trying to hold the position steady, but he actually ends up missing an opportunity here with d4. So this is of course pointed out by Stockfish. I think few players are finding this move on their own, especially in time trouble. And so the tactical point here, number one, is that c takes d4, rook c2 is a very nice shot with rook c6 check coming next, and then knight takes f5 on the agenda. The knight cannot be captured because of check, and then black is either taking this rook or taking this rook. White is either taking one of these rooks, and black's king cannot defend both. And instead, after rook takes d4, rook takes d4, c takes d4, white can play this move knight to c2. This pawn is currently extra, but it's hard for black to hold on to it, and if he plays king to d5 here, white has this trick knight takes d4. And otherwise black would be winning, but this is of course a very nice shot that ends up equalizing the position for white. After king d4, rook to d2, white wins back the piece and escapes into a rook endgame where white is probably just not going to be worse. The rook is going to be very active in this situation, and both sides will need to be careful here not to fall worse. So that was basically Ding's one shot, and probably Wang Hao could have avoided this, but as the game continues, black basically just kind of takes over here, grabs this pawn on h4, rook to g2 was played, and now rook to g4. Really, really fantastic move. White could capture this exchange, and he ends up doing so later on in the game, but after f takes g4, black's pawns here are simply going to be way too strong. So rook h2 is the continuation. Black plays g6, white takes on g4, fg4 check, king e3, bishop e7, and here black is actually just completely winning. All of his pieces are going to be extremely strong in the position. The king is coming to f5, the pawns are going to push h4 to g3, the rook is controlling everything, the bishop is a good piece as well, and white's rooks here simply have no activity, and black is just going to win with these kingside pawns. In fact, the game ended very quickly after rook c2, h4. Liren just resigned here, probably disgusted with how he played the game. You know, he had the small advantage in the opening, and he ends up throwing everything away with this one move f4, and he basically just probably didn't want to play this one out, understanding that the position is basically lost. Again, the king is coming in with f5, g3, king to g4, and white's rooks are just going to be kind of helpless against these two connected passers. So really a huge win for Wang Hao in round one. He's considered one of the tournament's outsiders. He qualified through the Isle of Man tournament, and he definitely isn't considered elite compared to guys like Fabiano and Liren. But of course, with this game, he makes a huge statement that he is here to play, and well, if you give him a chance, he will absolutely take it and end up punishing you. Moving on to the next decisive game of the day, this one between Anish Giri and Jan Nepomniachtchi. And in this one, Giri was really well prepared in the opening. The guys played this very theoretical line in the symmetrical English with g3, queen b6, knight d5, knight e5, bishop f4. There's tons of games here from the world's top players. I think this line was more popular several years ago, maybe even a decade ago. Since then, it's kind of been worked out to a draw, but clearly there are ways to poke and put pressure here for both sides, especially with new engines like Lila really being useful for the preparation of these top players. It's quite possible to find very new ideas in lines that were previously considered to be kind of dead. So here Anish was prepped pretty deeply, and I'll just take you guys to some of the critical moments in this game. He plays this move rook c1, which up until this game was only played once in correspondence. Around here, Nepo starts spending a lot of time indicating that he wasn't fully familiar with the position, whereas Giri basically blitzes the next several moves out. D5 is played here, b3, and it's a very sharp position. I think it basically just takes a very powerful engine to really try and figure out what's going on here. But white is putting a lot of pressure on black. Black is currently up one pawn, but of course this b5 pawn is hanging, and black has to be very precise here not to just fall into a very bad position. Bishop b4 was played, sacrificing the knight on c4 somewhat temporarily after bc4. Rook a3, black is basically going to be able to win this guy back with queen to a5. And again, it's not clear how deep Nepo knew this line, how deeply he was prepared, but his play is at a very high level, and he's able to kind of manage things for quite some time, whereas Giri was very clearly still in prep here. Bishop e5 is played, f6, bishop d4, queen a5, and now bishop e2. Simply giving the knight back on c3, not trying to win it back. And then after bishop takes c3, rook takes c3, rook takes c3, Giri plays this fantastic move, king f1. I think he played this one quite quickly as well, indicating that this is still very much in his preparation. So his point is that he just doesn't want to give up the dark-scored bishop anymore. His idea is to play g5 very quickly and just start putting a ton of pressure on black on this diagonal. Now here I believe the engines were giving the move b takes c4 as their top choice here, after which the game likely would have continued g5 with a total mess. Instead, Nepo plays b4. And here I think Giri goes into a pretty deep think, spent something like 18 minutes, indicating that this move was probably not the main line of his prep, and then it becomes unclear whether he checked it at all, whether he checked it but doesn't remember his analysis, and ends up just going into the tank. So he plays g5. This is kind of the thematic move for white in the position. Again, he's just not interested in taking this rook right away. Instead, he wants to put some pressure on black structure. Black goes e5. Now white is forced to take the rook on c3. B takes c3, gf6 is played, gf6, and here I think Giri starts to go slightly wrong with this move, queen to b1. What he should have done was just capture this pawn on d5 with c takes d5. It's not clear what exactly he didn't like about this. Perhaps he didn't want to give up the a2 pawn, but after something like queen to d3, bishop d7, and king to g2, The engines give white a slight plus here. It's a very, very sharp position, but it does seem like white's king is safer. His structure is potentially healthier if he can pick up this pawn in the near future, and it's not clear what black is going to be doing with the king, because of course the king cannot castle on account of the h7 pawn hanging in this position. So he instead plays this move queen to b1, covering the a2 pawn, but also keeping an eye on h7 and stopping black from castling. Nepo goes back, queen to c7, queen d3 is played, and I think this is where things again just start sliding a little bit more and more wrong for white. So this is always a tough situation for players when you've kind of out-prepared your opponent and they've already been thinking for a while, but they come up with a decent response, and all of a sudden you have to try to figure out, you know, what was the engine line here, how much of an advantage am I playing for, can I get a big advantage here, am I just playing for a small advantage? And I think a lot of players end up going wrong when they're not able to kind of meet the standards of their computer in the moves when they're out of their preparation. Because here black ends up finding a very strong move b5, where if white takes this one, then of course black's c3 pawn becomes much stronger, as black can just defend this one with the queen. Instead white grabs on c3, but now after b takes c4, the c4 pawn and this whole pawn chain ends up being pretty dangerous for white. So Giri goes e4, trying to break up the structure, d takes e4, and rook h4. And my feeling here was that he was still trying to keep some kind of pressure slash advantage in the position. Had he just captured this pawn on c4, queen takes c4, bishop takes c4, white is a pawn down, but it's very hard to imagine that black really has any kind of realistic winning chances in this endgame. All of the pawns are on one side of the board for black, and a lot of these pawns are pretty weak, and it's hard for black to really make progress, and white has this nice outside pass pawn that he can always use for counterplay. But again, my feeling was that Giri was still being a little bit ambitious here, and he plays this move rook h4, just trying to keep more pieces on the board, but this ends up kind of landing him in a difficult position. Rook takes e4, castles, and now Giri ends up making a pretty huge mistake, perhaps a losing move if we take a look at the rest of the game with this move bishop takes c4. Best was to play the move rook h4, where, okay, white just keeps this pawn on c4 blockaded, keeps his rook on h4, meaning that it's very hard for black to really make any progress here with the extra pawn. And I think white has pretty decent compensation, and most likely the game would feel pretty drawish here. The problem with bishop takes c4 is that he ends up self-pinning here, and after a very strong move king to g7, threatening rook to c8, it turns out that white actually is having some real difficulties. Now the engine points out queen b4 as being best here, with the idea of rook b8, bishop to b5. It's very dangerous to play the move queen a4 here, where black can play, for example, rook b1, king g2, and then bishop d7, hitting the queen and getting ready to play bishop c6 next, which would win at least the exchange. And so instead white would have to play the move bishop to b5 here, again self-pinning, but with the idea that he can secure the bishop with the move a4. And here the engine thinks, okay, black is clearly better but not quite winning yet, but it's clear that this is kind of uncomfortable for white. So Giri ends up playing queen b3 here, with the idea of meeting rook to b8 with bishop takes e6, giving up his queen for a rook and bishop, and achieving this position after rook takes b3, rook g4 check, king f8, bishop takes b3. Now I would imagine during the game neither player had a good idea of whether this was actually winning for black or not, but it's clear that black is the only one playing for the two results here, and if black can kind of crack white's fortress, then of course can deliver the full point. So after queen c1 check, king g2, queen c6, king g1, Nepo starts grinding and pushing for the win. Here the engine slightly prefers rook h4, but after queen f3 it already is starting to feel quite difficult for white, where black's queen is just controlling everything. The plan is now to just slowly bring the king in, try to start pushing the pawns, and it's very difficult for white to push the a-pawn, of course, as this would destabilize the bishop on b3. So Giri goes rook g8 check, king e7, rook g7, and tries to keep the rook a little bit more active. Queen f3 happens on the board, rook h8, and now e4. And I think Nepo's technique in this game was really, really strong. I mean, so far he hasn't made any mistakes, and now he starts driving his pawns forward with the idea of trying to break up white's structure here on f2 and g3. If black is allowed to play the move e3, this will be very, very problematic, of course, for white's king, as black will be able to pick up all the pawns and leave himself with a couple of passers. So the game continues rook d8, bishop d1, queen c3, rook d5, but now it's clear that white's pieces have lost all coordination and things are starting to get very tricky. Of course, the pawn on h5 is hanging. Nepo decides to give it up, but actually get something in return for it, as after g takes h4, his two connected pawns now are much stronger, and if he can start pushing them, then again he can create a pass pawn and use this to win the game. So here he goes f5, taking advantage of the tactic that if rook takes f5, black can go queen e1 check, and then queen takes bishop. And Giri actually ends up going for this, which I think was a decent practical decision, as black has some technical difficulties winning that position with the queen versus the rook. And had he not done this, then again black's pawns were coming in. Once the pawn gets to f3 or e3, black can even use these pawns to start creating threats against white's king. So white decided to play rook takes f5 here, queen e1 check, king g2, queen takes d1. And now Giri could have grabbed the e-pawn here with rook e5, king f6, and rook takes e4. But this does seem to be a technical win for black, and I imagine he thought that white was losing here and that he would have better chances to leave this pawn on the board. Here, after queen d5, f3, and queen takes a2, we actually reach the table base range when the position is actually solved, and this one is a clear win for black. Now, if the pawn was back on f2 here, this would be a pretty well-known fortress where white can just leave the rook on e3 and swing it over to g3 and just swing back and forth, and the queen and king are not able to make any progress. But here, since white's pawn has been advanced to f3, this actually gives black some very serious winning chances. Going into how black wins this one is definitely above my pay grade, but long story short, black is trying to get the king actually behind white's pawns and using the queen to create some tension in white's position. If the king and queen can both get behind, then white's king is pushed forward and black will be able to crack the fortress. So instead, Giri ends up playing the move rook to g5, queen a1, rook g4, queen b1, rook g3, queen takes a2, and he tries to hold on to this position where his pawn was not forced to move up to f3, can stay on f2, and he's basically trying to make this fortress happen with rook g3, rook e3. Here, of course, the big trump for black is that he still has one pawn left on the board, and this pawn is actually enough for black to win the game. A lot of maneuvering here takes place, and Nepo, I think, comes up with a pretty decent plan here. First centralizes the queen, starts bringing in the king, and then he ends up leaving his queen here on d1, where it pretty much stops white's king from being able to reach the e2 square. So this is actually important. If we go back a couple moves at this position, black actually had an opportunity here to capture this pawn on h4. But it's very good that he didn't, because white would play the move rook to e3, and then after king d6, for example, king f1, if white is able to get the king to e2 here, which here it's very difficult for black to stop this, or the king can also sit on e1, then this position appears to be drawn according to the table base. Even though black has this extra pawn, he simply doesn't have a way to create winning chances, and white's rook will just swing back and forth between g3 and e3. The king tries to stay on e2 or e1, and black is ultimately not able to win this one. So I think Nepo showed some great understanding here, because he doesn't allow white's king to reach this critical e2 square, keeps his queen on the first rank, and after a few more maneuvers here, queen d2, king g2, queen d1, rook e3, king f6. Here he starts his next phase of the plan, which is actually to bring the king over to h5 and grab the h-pawn with his king. Now at this point, white has no way of stopping this. If rook e3, for example, king g6, and if white grabs this pawn, then black again plays this move queen to d5. King f3 is not possible because of king f5, so white would be forced to push his pawn up to f3, and of course we already know that this is a position that can be won for black with best play. Instead, Giri just keeps the rook on the third rank. Nepo brings his king over to h5, puts white in a couple of zugzwangs here, and white is forced to give up the pawn. Now after king takes h4, comes the second phase of the plan, where black starts to bring the king all the way back to the other side of the board and actually heads towards the d4 square. Now if white tried to just keep the king cut off with a move like king to h2, the problem is this allows queen f1, after which it becomes very difficult for white to hold on to this pawn and the fortress cracks. So white's king is kind of forced to stay on g2. It means it's kind of a zugzwang for white here, and he has to let the king out. Giri puts the rook on e3, queen d1, and now Nepo kind of shows the winning plan here, and this is basically the winning plan that only works if white's king is still stuck on the king's side, which is why I find this very, very instructive. Had the king been able to live on e2 and e1 here, black's winning idea basically wouldn't work. Here after rook e3, we see Nepo's big plan, which is the move queen to d3. And he simply sets up the exchange, queen versus rook. White, of course, cannot take this one, as after e takes d3, black is just immediately going to be able to promote the pawn. The king comes to c3, c2, and white is simply not in time. And if white tries to stay put with a move like rook to g3, the king just starts swinging around and heads towards the e2 and e1 squares, after which white is going to be in a zugzwang, and the rook is going to finally be forced to capture the queen, giving black this winning king and pawn endgame. For instance, after king h2, king d2, king g2, king e2, this is already a zugzwang, and white is basically lost. If king g1, black takes on g3 and creates this pass pawn, or after e3 followed by king d2, the pawn simply runs to promotion. So in the game after rook e3, queen d3, Giri just resigned here, as Nepo kind of demonstrates that he understands the winning idea. And once again, had white's king been somewhere in the range of e1, then this idea simply would not work for black. White could take the queen on d3, put the king in front of the pawn, and black wouldn't be able to promote. So very, very instructive win by Nepo here. Really, really high quality game. It gives me the feeling that he's in good form. He's shown up ready to play, ready to fight, and really try to convert these long games, which I think is going to be very important, as every point matters. Moving on to the next game, where we have Grischuk playing against Alekseenko. Alekseenko, of course, being the wild card of the tournament, and with Grischuk playing white here, I think he definitely needed to play for a win, and he came quite close. So the game featured an English opening, and we actually see the same opening that we saw, the same variation that we saw in Liren versus Wang Hao. Here Grischuk also plays d3 and opts for this reverse Sicilian dragon. But in this case, black chooses a different setup, starting with the move d5, and we essentially get this reverse open Sicilian, where the extra tempo certainly is valuable for white, but it's not always clear whether it's enough to get an advantage or just a healthy equal position. Well, something ends up going a little bit wrong for black. I feel like the position that they end up getting just feels kind of easier for white to play. Although technically Alekseenko doesn't really make a mistake until later on. White ends up playing e4 here, and white's idea is to actually, similar to the Liren game, play this move knight h4 and eventually try to get the move f4 and just gaining a lot of space and trying to build a very strong center. If white can trade off this e-pawn with e takes f4, g takes f4, then white will have a lot of pawns in the center and potentially a big space advantage. Bishop d6 is played, knight h4, bishop g4, provoking f3, but this is not a big deal for white, as he's just ready to push f4 anyway. Now after e4, g takes f4, Stockfish gives f6 as the only move that leads to equality for black, where it's a little bit hard for white to proceed here without allowing counterplay. A key point is that this move not only restricts white from playing e5, but also opens up the queen to try to get to h5, which is actually going to be uncomfortable for white to deal with. For instance, if white plays d4, which I think is not a good move, but just kind of illustrative here, black plays queen h5, queen f2, and now g5 is the big point. Of course, queen f2 here is kind of necessary, as this knight is hanging. Knight f3 would be met with bishop takes f4. Knight f5, white doesn't really want to play this move on account of bishop takes f5 and doubling white's pawns. But after queen f2, the queen is lined up on the f file with black's rook. FG is looking extremely dangerous for white's position, and white would kind of be forced to play knight f5. But here takes knight e7, for example, and white's structure is weak, and although the light squared bishop looks like quite a good piece, the dark squared bishop is of course very much out of the game, and black is doing great. Instead, white would just have to kind of take it a little bit slow after f6 here, and the position remains about equal. But Alekseenko instead plays the move knight a5, which definitely makes sense, and he has ideas of either playing c5 to kind of restrict white's position, or play moves like bishop c5 check, kind of provoking d4, or at least waiting for this move d4, where his knight can access the c4 square. He also introduces the threat of bishop a4 in the position, winning the exchange. Now at this point, white had a lot of good options here. For instance, I think queen f2 was quite strong. Grischuk chooses rook e1, but the thing is, he started spending lots and lots of time, as of course he's known for. And I was checking the game, and I think already in the opening he was spending like 2-3 minutes per move, like c4, e5, g3, and of course this time is going to be needed later on. And by this point he starts taking big things, 15, 18 minutes, and runs low on the clock, I think very, very quickly. By move 20, I think he was already way down. So he chooses the move rook de1, black plays queen d8, queen f2, and now Alekseenko tries this interesting trick with knight to c4, where the point is that the knight cannot be captured, as then after bishop c5, white would just be losing the queen. But Grischuk just backs up bishop to c1, and then after bishop c5, d4, bishop e7, the knight on c4 is definitely safe, but now white just goes back knight f3, and white's central pawns are actually looking pretty strong here. I think black should have played this move, bishop to c5. Probably this is what Grischuk was thinking about for so long, because here after d4, bishop to e7, black has a double attack. The knight on h4 is hanging, and bishop b5 threatens to win the exchange. So it turns out white can just sacrifice the exchange, knight f3, bishop b5, and now f5, and just give the rook and play this position with the two bishops and a huge mass in the center. Now it's easier to just go for this when you're analyzing with the engine, but over the board, in the most important tournament of your life, of course, you need some time to actually work things out and make sure that you're going to have a serious advantage here. Nevertheless, I think that's what black should have done, as in the game, I think white gets an advantage basically for free. And then after the move knight f3, black tried f5 in order to fight back against white center, try to fight for some of the light squares, but queen e2, knight d6, e5 followed, knight e4, and knight d2. So the way Grischuk handled the game, I think, was very strong. I mean, his play is really good, and he soon builds up just a very serious advantage here with such a big space advantage, and this idea to just play c4, d5, and really just steamroll all over black's position. But the problem is he spent way too much time getting here, and when the position gets a little bit sharp towards the time control, he's not able to figure out the best way forward. So the game continues bishop e6, queen d3. So of course he's more than willing to give up this a-pawn just to push d5 and get his huge pawns rolling. Black tries to fight for this blockade on the light squares, bishop e3, c6, a4, and now Alekseenko takes his chance with a6, which I think was a good practical decision, especially given Grischuk's time on the clock. Had black just continued with a move like rook fd8 and just kind of playing steady, then white has ideas here of just already pushing c4, for example. Rook will switch over to d1, and if white is able to get d5 in, then the game will just be over. So despite the lack of time, Grischuk of course is one of the best players in the world, especially in terms of blitz and playing with low time, and when it's kind of a safe and quiet position, he can still play at an extremely high level while just relying on the increment. So instead, black tried this move a6, which I think was a pretty decent practical try. Where if white does not take the pawn on a6, black will play b5, and again fight for all the light squares in the position, and make things kind of difficult for white. Especially after c4, the response likely would have just been b5, and just trying to secure the d5 square for black's bishop. Where the immediate d5 doesn't really work, as black can take on c4 and then take on d5. And white cannot take the bishop here, as black will then play queen takes d3 and of course have an extra queen. So Grischuk goes for the critical continuation, queen takes a6, he has to grab the pawn. Now black's idea was to play rook a8, queen takes b6, and bishop to d5. The a4 pawn was kind of poisoned in view of bishop takes c6, so instead his idea is to basically sacrifice 2 pawns, but at least get this blockade on the light squares and do this kind of positional sacrifice. And here Grischuk ends up going wrong. He plays queen to b2. It turns out the strongest continuation was for him to actually take on d5. Now if c takes d5, then white can play, for example, either queen to b5, and he has 2 extra pawns and a huge advantage, or even a move like king to h1, where he's willing to give back the a4 pawn, but just starts playing on the g file with rook to g1. He can double rooks on the g file. The h6 pawn will, of course, need protecting, and here white would have a nearly winning position where he can put a lot of pressure on the king side, and of course the d5 pawn will also need to be covered by black. But I think most likely he was probably worried about queen takes d5, where black's queen is much more active, and we can imagine seeing a lot of threats in the position from white's point of view, like rook b8 to rook b2, and it's clear that white's king on g1 could really experience a lot of issues. And so in time trouble, this is not a position we usually want to enter, where the opponent has a lot of counterplay. The engine points out kind of a forcing way to just get a huge advantage with c4. This would kind of have to be seen by white in advance. And the idea is that after queen c4, rook c1, let's say queen d3 and bishop f2, white is able to secure the king long enough to grab the pawn on c6 and take control over the light squares in the position. For instance, rook takes a4, queen takes c6, and black is just not really coordinated well enough to create any serious threats, whereas white is ready to push a d5, d6, and just get his pawns rolling, and well, once this happens, white's position is just going to be winning. So Grischuk ends up playing queen b2, just trying to keep it safe, but now after rook takes a4, black has won one of the pawns back and now has left himself with quite a bit of compensation for just the one extra pawn. And the game ends up liquidating here pretty quickly. Rook a1, the rooks get traded off, black takes on g2, king g2, queen d5 check. And here white's extra pawn is very, very hard to do anything with, as black is again just controlling all the light squares, and it's very difficult for white to push his pawns. And the game ended here just after the time control with king f2, king e2, and both sides repeating moves here with queen g2, queen e4 check, and queen to g2, with white's king not really having a good way of getting out of the checks, as the queen is coming back to e4 and the bishop will be hanging. So definitely a missed opportunity, but I would say this is kind of nothing new for Grischuk. He is often playing extremely strong, but at the cost of time, and in lots of his games his time pressure ends up costing him valuable half points. Moving on to the final game of the round, MVL versus Caruana. Arguably the marquee game of the round, with Caruana being a clear favorite or one of 2 favorites, and MVL of course being the last player to actually enter the tournament, of course replacing Timur Rajabov at the last second. I personally felt like MVL has good chances in this tournament. There's this phenomenon that tends to happen when a player joins the tournament late, is one of the last participants added, or replaces someone. A lot of times they don't have the same pressure as everyone else has, because they haven't been thinking about this tournament for months and months. That said, MVL has had a dramatically less time to prepare for the tournament compared to everyone else, and of course this is a huge factor in elite tournaments too. So we end up getting a Arkhangelsk variation. This has been part of Caruana's repertoire for a couple of years now, so I'm sure it was not a huge surprise to MVL. And he ends up playing a pretty trendy line here with d4, bishop b6, and this move a5. Before the last couple of years, the main line was considered a takes b5 followed by knight a3, or just knight a3 immediately, where black is actually usually comfortable giving up this pawn on b5 and ends up getting some compensation. Tons and tons of theory, but it has essentially been worked out to be quite holdable for black. Instead, MVL chooses this move, a5, where the idea is that black cannot really grab this pawn with either the bishop or the knight, as white will then play d takes e5 and win a more important pawn in the center. Instead, bishop a7 is the theoretical move. And both players here kind of follow the main line theory. Caruana goes ed, cd4, and knight to b4. It's important to point out that this e4 pawn is almost never hanging in this type of position, as white typically has either the move bishop d5, or in some cases d5 is also quite unpleasant. For instance, if black's bishop was already on b7, then white could play d5, and the idea would be to meet bishop takes e3 with d takes c6 in between move, hitting that bishop on b7 and winning a piece. Instead, black plays knight to b4, knight c3, bishop to b7, and it feels like white has quite a nice position here with these two pawns in the center, but black's point is that these pawns are often just coming under serious fire with moves like rook e8 and c5 on the agenda. Here MVL plays knight to g5, and we get the first new move of the game with queen to e7. And here white ends up going for e5, where after d takes e5, he does not take back, as black can probably just get away with maybe taking on e3 and then taking this pawn. Instead, white plays knight takes f7. Now I think MVL was spending a little bit of time around here, but probably this was still within his preparation, as he does kind of follow the computer line here. Caruana plays e4, but now I'm actually kind of second guessing this, because knight d6 as played in the game is not really the engine's top choice, and it does kind of feel like black gets a slightly better position here. Stockfish suggests to play knight g5 check, and I have to say it's 100% clear that Caruana was well within his preparation. Number one, he was playing quickly, and number two, few players would allow such a discovered attack against their king, where it seems like white can literally put their knight anywhere without being very, very sure that the position is safe and playable for black. So Stockfish was suggesting knight g5 check, king h8, knight e6, and actually gives white a little bit of an advantage here, but I'm sure Caruana's team had this all worked out, and we basically just get an extremely sharp position. White probably has to push d5 here, bishop takes e3, f takes e3, and maybe something like rook b c8, trying to play either c5 or c6 and challenge this pawn on d5. And it seems like black is okay, but yeah, the position is of course extremely sharp. Instead, we got knight d6 check in the game, and then knight takes b7, grabbing the light squared bishop. One nice trick pointed out by Magnus in the commentary was that the move bishop to d5, blocking the check this way, seems like a nice move against everything except knight d takes e4. A pretty cool tactic, where if black captures the knight with his own knight, then after knight takes d5, white is winning material. And if bishop takes b3, white takes with the queen with check and has already won one pawn and doing quite well. So king h8 in this situation is forced. Knight takes b7 was played, rook b7, queen e2. Now Caruana plays c6. Nice maneuver, just bringing the rook to d7. Rook a d1 followed, rook d7, and although white has the two bishops here, he does have some potential problems, especially with the pawn on d4 being isolated and under attack. So MVL goes f3 here. This was absolutely the only move. He needs to kind of fight back and create some space in the position. ef3, rook takes f3. Now I think maybe the move rook e8 would have posed a little bit more problems for white, where black's idea is to threaten the move queen to d8, after which there's just tons of pressure on the e and d files. White would have to find the move king to h1, and then after something like c5 here, dc5, bishop takes c5, we get this situation where material is equal. Feels like maybe black is slightly better, as this pawn on a5 could end up being a problem for white in the future, especially after knight to c6, but with best play objectively, white should be able to hold this one. Instead, Caruana just played his move c5 immediately, which strategically does make sense. He is trying to trade off the dark squared bishops here and just leave himself with two knights against bishop and knight. MVL decides to take, rook d1, knight takes d1, bishop takes c5, queen f2. And actually, Caruana does something surprising here and keeps the bishop with bishop to d6. I guess he did not want to take and allow white to kind of bring in his knight very quickly with knight f5 coming. Instead, keeps his bishop on d6, and now white doesn't have such great prospects for the knight on d1. Plays knight to c3. From here, the game continued knight d3 and knight to c5. And yeah, I think even though white has the two bishops here, it feels like black is the one that's slightly more comfortable. White's king on g1 still has some back rank issues, especially with this bishop on d6 covering the h2 square, and this pawn on a5 is always a potential weakness if white is not careful. Eventually things end up just liquidating here. After the following moves, knight e4, takes, queen to d3. I think this was kind of the last moment had black played rook to d8 here. Could have kept a little bit of pressure. Yeah, the position just doesn't feel fully comfortable for white, as it's kind of his king that's a little bit less safe here. Instead, Caruana played knight to g5, which allows white to take. Bishop c5 check was thrown in, otherwise the bishop would be hanging on d6. Now the bishop on e3 would be hanging, so white cannot really block. King h1, queen takes g5, and we get this position with opposite color bishops. Now with queens and rooks on the board, it doesn't mean that the winning chances are completely over, especially with white having potentially some serious problems on the dark squares. But MVL is kind of able to liquidate with this move, queen to d5. Queen e2 was played, so Caruana tries to keep some pieces on the board, but white here stays active enough that black isn't really able to orchestrate any kind of real counterplay. So here Caruana ends up going back, queen e5. Of course, it'd be important not to blunder bishop a7, queen f8 check. That would be a real problem. So queen e5 is played, they trade queens and go into this endgame with rooks and opposite color bishops where neither side has any real winning chances. After a couple of moves, bishop b7, rook b2, rook a2, takes. We have one of these positions that is often reached at the elite level where they just find a way to kind of liquidate everything off the board, and we finish with a situation that's basically unwinnable for both sides, and the game was agreed drawn here on move 44. So yeah, really exciting start to the tournament with 2 decisive games out of 4. A lot of times these elite tournaments are kind of snooze fests with so many draws every round, but I don't think we're going to see that in this tournament, especially with such a wide mix of players, some lower rated players that the stronger players are going to want to beat up on. But it's clear that, you know, that we can't take anything for granted in this tournament, with Wang Hao already showing that he's not a player to be messed with. And Alekseenko, I think an impressive draw with black, although he was worse for most of the game. He was able to create some counterplay and muddy the waters enough to eventually escape with a draw. So if you guys enjoyed the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel, and please give us a thumbs up or a like on the video, as it really does help the channel grow. And we'll be covering the tournament every day from here on out with these daily recap videos, as well as the move of the day from Grandmaster Jesse Cry. Alright guys, hope you have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Take care.